the front end. Like there is a trend, to try to integrate different tools. We actually think that one tool integrating everything works a little bit better if it's done. And people mostly use us to start companies, even though probably 30% of the use cases we see are people building internal tools for existing businesses or like non-essential software solutions for their businesses. And 70% are building like the customer-facing main product that the company is selling. Today, we have a team of about 25 people. In terms of fundraising, so I'm not an investor. I can certainly talk about that, having raised around myself last year. I've been a very vocal fan of bootstrapping for many, many years. I still am, actually, in many ways. I would highly recommend bootstrapping your businesses. And I think NoCode is actually a great enabler for bootstrapping, because another way to picture what NoCode is about is just reducing the cost of technology dramatically. But so in our case, so we bootstrapped for like 7 years, getting to a team of like 12 people without additional funding. And we raised our round last year as the market was starting to really heat up. And I think the opportunity now is real. I've certainly seen a very big changes in terms of how much adoption there is for the idea and the tools themselves, but even the idea, because again, between 2012 and 2017, people thought that NoCode would just be like another Squarespace or Wix, and they were like, why would you lose your time to do that? And after 2017, I think because two things happened. The tools got better, and at the same time, learning how to code didn't work, I think, for people. Like they tried, and they realized it was actually hard and was taking too much time. And so the combination of those two things with with better tools meant that people realized that NoCode was actually more than just building a simple web page like Squarespace or Wix were offering. I've actually and I think what we're going through right now, I mean, in our case, I mean, we've seen, and I would assume it's true for Adalo as well, like we've seen a huge bump in usage, honestly, over the last 4 weeks, because NoCode is more important than ever, because right now what people want to de-risk a little bit what they're undertaking, especially financially, and they want to be able to launch things much cheaply because it's harder to fundraise. And at the same time, also happens that people have more time. So people right now, they're short on cash, but they have more time, and that's when NoCode is actually much more reliable, relevant than before. So we'll see how long it lasts. I mean, but my guess is that this natural evolution that had to happen, which is technology is too expensive to create and should get cheaper, is just being accelerated currently, and investors are going to start realizing that. So we'll get into the conversation when we talk about investors. But I think like investors investing in NoCode companies will be much bigger.
I agree with everything that you're saying. I think we're at a huge transition point right now, in my opinion, similar to that of what happened with websites in the early 2000s, where in the 90s and early 2000s, to build a website, you needed to know HTML or CSS or whatever, right? Then you started seeing these website builders come along, and now you can build a website very easily with a lot of different tools. And I see this starting to now happen with apps, software, and all this stuff with the platforms that you guys are building, right? And I think it's this huge new wave that's coming, and that's why I'm super excited about this space and why we want to keep doing these events and stuff. So yeah, that was I think it's really important that what you guys are all doing and where things are going. I think it's really changing the whole demographic and the whole barrier to entry for people building out technology companies now. David, we'll jump into your story. Tell us about Adalo and everything. I know you guys have an awesome product. I mean, it's really cool to use and building out apps and stuff. So fill us in.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so I have a traditional design background, so I don't know how to code. I definitely fall into that bucket of, like I built or helped build it. I didn't actually code this product, but I helped, build this product to solve my own problems. So, I originally came actually from architecture, and then I got my master's of architecture, and then right after that, actually decided to jump course. I started doing UX design for a startup, convinced them here in St. Louis that I could do UX design, even though I didn't know what I was doing at the time. And then, I was doing that for, about, I guess, 7 years. And I watched the transition of design tools go from like the really like days of like where balsamic was like what everybody used. And if you don't know what balsamic was, you know, it still is very useful for wireframing, but you know, it was a very crude looking tool, right? Where today, you know, it's just so beautiful what you're able to create with mockups, right? Where we got to a point where, you know, I would present to the company I present my mockups every week, and people would say like, oh, like, so that'll be ready next week? And I would be like, no, like now developers, you know, must go do those things. I think it was those times, plus like there was that debate where I think it's cooled down a little bit, where if you were a UX designer but you didn't know how to code, then you weren't a real UX designer. And I think I remember thinking to myself, like, I tried learning to code and it was like a barrier for me. And I was just like, at some point, like, you know, these tools are evolving so fast, like you won't have to learn how to code to get into those types of things. So I think that was like part of the initial inspiration of watching these design tools get better and more realistic. And then, you know, me not having the ability to make it. So then me and another coworker actually started, you know, working on this on the side, and then actually ended up, we met some random woman at this one event, and then like she connected us to Jeremy, our other co-founder, out in the Bay Area. So it was a total lucky like coincidence. He was working on it out there, and we were working on it in St. Louis. So I definitely can talk a little bit about we can get a longer story about it, but the shorter term is, you know, it's interesting to see from an investment perspective, like what the Midwest is like versus the Bay Area, and, you know, kind of seeing those two perspectives from our lens, you know, has kind of been interesting. And then, yeah, so getting a little bit into, you know, what Adalo can do. So you can publish to Google Play and Android and Apple App Store. So native apps written in React Native, as well as then we translate that for the web. So we're definitely mobile first, and then, but you can also build, you know, simple web apps on ours. And we've seen that be really useful for people, you know, building an admin side of whatever that is, or an internal tool on the web app, and then connecting that to your mobile app. So kind of going back and forth there. You know, really excited to be a part of this no-code community. You know, I definitely consider myself not like the traditional entrepreneur in somewhat of a sense of like, you know, I was more passionate about solving this specific problem than maybe like bouncing around and like becoming an entrepreneur. Like I didn't go to school to become an entrepreneur. I know some people are like, you know, take that in school, and, you know, some of the other co-founders that was their major. So they had like that mindset from the beginning. I think I fell into this a little bit by like seeing this problem and being annoyed that, you know, I couldn't make what I wanted a reality. So yeah.
Actually, I don't know if you know, but Jeremy almost interned with us.
Yeah.
Back in 2013 or 2014. Like
yeah, he did. Yeah, he did tell us that, which is crazy. That
Yep.
he was almost an intern, and then we ended up connecting and working on it together. So I guess it's all little no code world here.
Yeah,
Yep.
That's hilarious. Well, that's how. So if you guys don't, Jeremy is David's co-founder of Adalo, and I actually met him at the Launch Scale conference in San Francisco. So that's how I got connected with you guys. And then he was telling me, because that's the story of how you guys met, right? Because some girl from that same conference introduced you guys together or whatever. So it's kind of hilarious how.
Yeah, and I met her actually at like a travel bloggers conference because I was there for like the previous company that I was at, like in like Cornings, New York, I think. So you never know. The moral of the story is you never know at an event like who is actually going to be important that like later on like will have a big you know, impact on your life. So I talked to her for like 2 hours that day, and, you know, kind of changed everything.
Yeah. Well, that's why we, you know, like all of my meaningful connections for the most part, our investors, my partners, all of that have come through our events or other events. It's kind of wild. That's why I encourage everyone to like do events, go to events, everything. Why we do these events, because you never know the one person who you're going to randomly meet, whether that be the speaker or just an attendee, who could totally change your whole life. So that's wild. Fantastic. Well, thank you guys for sharing your backstories. I want to throw out kind of, and we could start with Ryan too, and start getting into the funding topic and raising money. So as a VC and everything, as you guys were looking at the no code industry, when you were going through companies and all this stuff, how did you approach, how did you approach that from that perspective? And then I guess I'd also like to hear your thoughts on how you've been going about raising money now for your own company too. So I'm sure you've gotten some insights as to when you were a VC and everything, and then how things evolved as you've seen the no-code industry kind of transform over the last few years. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's really quite funny. So in a lot of ways, it's easy to pitch VCs on no-code businesses like ours because VCs themselves are pretty enthusiastic no-coders as a group often. So when we started our business, we bootstrapped it by being data scientists, by being consultants, and we worked with a few venture funds, and we talked to a lot of venture funds about what they wanted to do with their data science, and just about everyone had this very, very no-code stack sort of patched together with Zapier, and they had, okay, here's all of our. It was always the same thing too. It was like we have here's our deal pipeline, and this feeds into our database. So VCs are no-coders by nature. They're kind of they're quasi-technical, but they want to build stuff. So it's a pretty receptive group. When I was actually doing these investments, that was before we called it no-code. So things have changed a lot since then. I think it's gotten continually easier to raise money as a no-code business. I feel like we're in that stage right now where no-code is kind of the buzzword that everyone has on the second page of their pitch deck, basically, because it's kind of like what people like to talk about. And last year it was blockchain, and 2 years ago it was AI, and there's always that one thing. But everyone likes to position themselves as no-code right now for sure. And that's because it really is legitimately hot and rising in the venture community. So I think there's just a lot of momentum with investors right now. So then I guess that kind of gets into how would an investor look at a no-code business, basically. Now, there's two things to discuss that we can talk about here. One is, when I'm saying no-code business, I mean like stuff that we're doing, which is, we use code to build a tool, but it's a tool for no-coders. And then there's also, we can spend some time talking about a business that's run by a maker who doesn't code. I think both those are really interesting things to talk about. But just talking about the former first, how you'd evaluate that as a VC. There's a lot of things that are in common with traditional software businesses, but then there's also a few sort of distinguishing things that you really have to think about. And for example, one of the bigger things is sort of low code versus no code. And where do you draw that boundary? Is it really no code? Is one of the first questions you have to ask, especially with those hot buzzwordy things. Is it really a blockchain startup? Is it really an AI startup? Because everyone puts it in their deck. There's an interesting distinction here where right now I feel like low code and no code are very much bundled together, side by side. And I think that's true in the investor community as well, because I hear those used simultaneously and interchangeably a lot. I might have a controversial opinion that they are, that there's definitely they're different businesses, because as soon as you have those first lines of code in there, that really changes who your target user is, who your demographic is. By the time, adding that, first single sort of code type function, suddenly you're selling more to people who have that very different background. So that's a big important question I still have, is how no code is this tool? That's really a fundamental part of sort of understanding who the user is and who the customer is of that business, which is what VCs do all the time. The other interesting sort of thing is, when you understand those people, that really has a big impact on understanding the go-to-market for the business. And that is no code is also very unique because you've got a really passionate group of users, the maker community, who are organized and growing and very actively sharing things online. and sharing tools online. And so that's like there's a really interesting inherent go-to-market strategy there for a no-code business. And one of the unique questions that VCs have to ask themselves is, how tapped into that community is this business? Are they capitalizing on this? Does the nature of the business model work well with the maker community? So it's just questions like that I guess you'd ask. But I would say, to summarize, that the trend has been, very, very dramatically upward. And as an entrepreneur, when I speak with investors, the thing that always resonates with them is the no-code thing. I say we're a no-code data science tool, it is this, and get an email later. Oh, so you're that no-code tool, the no-code data science tool. So that seems to really, really have legs, I guess, right now.
Yeah, it seems like it's definitely a hot topic. It's kind of like becoming what AI was like a few years ago, in a lot of senses, as like a word and a phrase that people are starting to gravitate towards now, as a hot item. Even though it's been around for so long, there's like finally a name for it, I think. So it's easier for people. But I want to jump to Emmanuel and get your thoughts on all of this and fundraising. I know you guys have raised a pretty significant amount of money for Bubble itself, but I also know you're a fan of bootstrapping too. So I want to get your thoughts on, I guess, number one, obviously you wanted to raise money so you guys could scale fast and grow. But what do you see as far as the companies within and using Bubble and building companies with Bubble? How do you recommend they go about it? Or how would you recommend some of these other no-coders, go about raising money and things? Should they just be bootstrapping it? Should they be thinking about raising money? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of topics here. So over the last 8 years, because our focus was always on having entrepreneurs starting companies on top of us, I've seen it all in terms of how different the reception was from investors when they would pitch Bubble-powered tools. It was, I think, basically impossible to raise money until 2017. Then a few people managed to do it, and today I don't think actually investors would push back if someone would tell them it's built on a no-code solution or Bubble. Because now the no-code thing is known enough. And that's one of the advantages of the buzz that we have around this is, I think, investors, what they need to find is reasons to say no. That's the toughest thing for an investor because they get pitched great ideas all the time and they need to find good reasons to say no. And so until 2017, building, it was not even called no tools. It was, we're building that on this obscure technology, like, for instance, Bubble, that nobody really knows about because it's being bootstrapped and everything. Then it's a good reason to say no. Today, investors see the advantage, which means you can create technology much cheaper because at the end of the day, investors, they just want people to be able to do more with less. That means less money and higher valuation eventually. So they see the gain in speed that people can have when they can push things. And then the speed of iteration, of cost, is in speed. Like speed of iteration is one of the major significant things of no-code tools. I think for us, the most successful case, one of our clients raised $365 million. It's a little bit different because they were in the fintech space, but in the more startup marketplace type of things, there is a company in Paris that raised I think 18 million, and they built their entire first version to that point on Bubble, for instance. So it is possible, and at that point, people were not pushing back because as long as you have traction, honestly, investors are not going to care too much. So I would definitely, now, what we recommend our users to do when they reach out, because sometimes we're trying to build a little bit of a program around, we're actually working on our own accelerator to do this, like a better program to assist companies that are started on top of us. Whether you should fundraise or bootstrap, I don't think it matters. Like the technology you're using is not really the point here. The key thing is really, can your business sustain exponential growth or not? And if it can't, I would recommend not fundraising and then use no-code tools because it's much cheaper instead of putting your personal savings or doing a family and friends round. If you can support exponential growth, then you should fundraise regardless of what you've been using as a technology because it is easier to raise. It is easier to grow if you have money, and if you can sustain exponential growth, you're not going to have disappointment eventually. Because what kills startups at some point is that investors get disappointed in what they're seeing, and then you try to raise the next round and it's not working out. And we've seen both. I would say probably 70% of The stories I know about on Bubble, Bootstrap, 30% fundraise. Some do half of it, which means, they go to an accelerator and then they decide not to fundraise. The share of people fundraising is going up definitely because investors have better reception, which is great for the NoCode ecosystem as a whole at some point because it means more money, so more gains. Me personally, I mean, for the Bubble story, I'm very glad we bootstrapped for the first years because honestly, when we started in 2012, the product, the market, the willingness of users to play with NoCode tool was not there. And had we raised around back in 2013, I think we would be out of business today. In fact, there were two players that I don't think anyone would know the names here that started 1 year after us, and they did YC and raised a round, and they both went out of business after a year because they ended burning their cash and not having a product that was ready, and at the same time, the community of users, of makers, did not exist back then. Today, it's a little bit different because tools have gotten better, so it's easier to raise with the current tools, and also because NoCode is a thing, the community is much more willing to try new tools, which lets you get early users early on and traction.
I was just, Ryan and I were just chatting. He's going to drop some of these companies that have raised money and built their whole company on Bubble. It's pretty wild. Like I knew some people did, but I didn't realize the magnitude of how much money some of these companies have raised building their products on Bubble.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, investors don't care.
As long as there's traction, right?
As long as it works, whatever,
Exactly. That's the funniest thing. Like everything I've realized over the last few years, as far as raising money goes, nothing matters besides a proof of concept and traction, right? If you're Joe Schmo, whoever, a 14-year-old in Wyoming, whatever, and you have 1 million people coming to your website a day, or you've made $1 million ARR, you're going to be able to raise money from pretty much anyone because you have the proof, right? And that's everything. So if you can go to market faster with these tools and these products, now you can get customers faster, you can show traction faster, and that speeds up the entire process of all of this. So I think it's fantastic. I know Ryan's going to be dropping in all these links in here. David, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. I know in your intro you were talking about a little bit too of the difference between the Midwest money and the Bay Area money. I'm in Pittsburgh, right? Like I've kind of seen it coming from here, and then also in New York and the Bay Area. So I'd love for you to talk about that, and then also too what you've seen from companies building products, with you guys too. I'm sure there's been companies that have raised money, with apps on your platform too. So I'd love for you to kind of talk about that, similar to Emmanuel as well.
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. I'll start first with the I guess our raise and kind of what I learned from the different sides there. So one thing was that became this is my first time raising. So for me, I was learning so much, which was fascinating, and I definitely realized the out west, they were a lot more receptive to your engagement in terms of the number of users and your traction there with actual engagement, and then looking at how that could go forward. Whereas, the Midwest was a little more traditional in only wanting to see specific MRR numbers, and that being the crucial thing. So I definitely think it made it really apparent, when we say, oh, you have to have traction. Well, it's there's different types of traction, and there's different types of traction for what your product is, right? Some people can't, or it's more difficult to sell their product before they have a bunch, it's maybe it's, your traditional social media where it's it's all about, getting users and engagement there before you actually then, can potentially get a paying customer. And then there are other businesses that maybe are more about, you can get a paying customer. But I definitely think, we've all said, but focusing on traction in some way is the most important thing. I think a lot of people come in and, you know, immediately think that their app that they make, like as soon as they put it into the app store, is gonna like, you know, have 1 million downloads, and like they need to be ready for like those things. Like I've had so many conversations and so many like you know, people get nervous about factors that are like way down the line, where, you know, it's like, hey, like they're worried about like that person, and like what happens like if they're using my app. I don't want to like say the exact app idea, but like they're using this app, and like what happens if they pass away? Like what happens to their data? And I'm like, if you run into that problem, like that is a really long life cycle, and like that's a fantastic, you know, problem to have. So
Yeah. But if we have too many users and we can't
so
scale,
you know, and I think that's what has been a little bit of like, you know, oh, I don't want to be on a no-code platform. Like what happens if I can't scale? It's like, well, you know, like you just go get one person who's like legit using your product to solve either your problem or to paying you to solve it, which means that you really know that you're solving their problem because like they're actually paying for it, right? So like for us, like I was like the one person dev shop. Like I went out and like sold people on apps, and then we would just build it like on Adalo, you know, on like, it was just me building on Adalo. Like I was like a one person dev shop to like start. And then like, that's how we knew like we had legit people that were willing to pay like a decent amount of money to have a product that was built on our product. And we're like, okay, I think like it's getting closer. And, you know, like, but the first people that we went out, like we hardly charged them anything, right? And then, you know, we worked its way up because we were proving things. So I think it's similar to that, in that, you know, finding some traction with initial people. And maybe that's if your product supports like, or aligns itself a little more with paying, then you do that. If not, at least getting users to like really have their problems be solved, I think is another thing. I think I had a couple of things written down. And like, I think what's interesting about no code as well is like, I think when people initially thought about, especially maybe like mobile apps, but any kind of software, right? You know, we think like, okay, like if I want to make this thing, like it has to have like 1 million users. So then of course, like I need to go raise money. But I think what I've learned is it's not so much about like, and like you can still bootstrap and get to those, you know, 1 million users. It's not necessarily about like, oh, like the size of your end product. I think it's a little more about kind of what Emmanuel was talking about, but you know, in the sense of how long does your product take to make before like it has value, right? Like something like a no-code product, like there's so much that goes into it before like it has any value, right? Like, you know, if you wanted to start building a no-code platform today, like in like a week from now, you couldn't have something that provided that much value. Whereas there are other types of problems that you can solve that you can get a working solution in a short amount of time. So I think it's not like about your end goal of whether you should like raise money because like I want to go like IPO and be huge. It's a little bit about like, you know, what is like the minimum requirements that I need before I have something that people will like either use from like traction standpoint or use from like traction revenue standpoint, and decide like there whether you need to, I guess, bootstrap or raise.
And I think too, you know, it seems like the common theme too that we're seeing is traction as well. And I think a big part of this also is now that you guys have built these, you know, platforms, the barrier to entry is a lot easier, right? So now we could have, you know, 100 people building, you know, a social media platform on your platform. So now the question is going to become what differentiates each platform from each other. And I want to get into real quick before we get into Q&A. So people, please drop questions that you have in the chat here. But I want to get into and hear all of your guys' thoughts really quickly on kind of the future of no code. Where do you guys see this going in the next 5-10 years? You know, what are the capabilities of what you guys are going to build with your own platforms, and then where things are going to go as a whole? Do you see AI playing a picture into this? Do you see coding kind of going away and everything moving more towards design and UX and user experience? What are your thoughts on all of this? And we can kind of I mean, let's just keep the same rotation if we want here to make it easy too.
Cool. I
Yeah.
guess that's me then.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and the way that I think about that is that the no-code movement, we have a name for it now, but it hasn't been a step change. We've been sort of evolving for increasingly no-code, for the last 30 years or so. And well, like I said, I used to be an engineer. When I was an engineer, I used to write like machine learning code, which is like just little. It's unintelligible to people. And then they started making low-level languages like C and everything, and then you start seeing higher levels of abstraction. And we read a lot of our stuff in Python, which is sort of halfway to no code already, for example. And really, the history of computing and of technology has been increasing levels of abstraction. And I think we're starting to hit the inflection point of that right now because of some of the sort of advances that are happening in the AI space. And you'd see stuff like, natural language recognition, for example, is going to have very profound impacts. And the way that you interact with an Alexa now is sort of like an extension of the way you interact with a computer from 15 years ago. So I think the no-code movement is it feels like it just sort of started, but this is really the elbow in the curve of this just going to be continually increasing to higher levels of abstraction. And who knows how I can go. Like when I do think there's going to be a time when code looks like natural language. It looks like people just typing and talking the same way that they would talk to a friend. The question for that in my mind really is when. And is it 5 years? Probably not. Is it 10 years? 8?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think you're muted again.
Yep.
Usually there's an icon that will pop up, but I don't see
it's not like you have a company that like does events. It's not like you're the host or anything, right?
You think I would be used to this? Yeah, no, I think those were fantastic points, and we had some questions come in that are related to that we'll get to during the Q&A session too. So, Emmanuel, what are your thoughts on the future of all?
I think a little bit of a contrarian opinion here, actually. I think there will be more code coming into no code, and that's for the best. Because at the end of the day, as much as I want to say that no code does everything, it's not true. Like no code is a high level of abstraction, which means there will always be, not for every application, like most of our users don't need to extend the platform with code, but there will always be, 5% or 10% of applications that actually do something that cannot be really expressed in a visual way with visual programming. And then you will need to bring someone on board to write code. In Bubble today, we have a plugin ecosystem where people can write code. And I think what's exciting, what's going to come in the next, hopefully 5 years, is more and more coders are going to start seeing the benefit of using no-code tools. And no-code will then become, the common language between, product/non-technical people or product/business people, because they are really the one that should be building the product because they know the needs better. And the coders that will be brought in to extend the platform when needed with the secret sauce that this company would have. So to give an example, for instance, imagine you're building like a dating platform. Most dating platforms, honestly, they look the same. Where they might have something different is the way they match people. Maybe one company will figure out a way to match people in a much smarter way. You were never going to do that in no code. Like, let's not, bullshit people. Back to this AI question you were having, that's basically whether it's machine learning or like something different to match people, I don't know. But this is something that would be expressed with code. And so you're going to have a business person or a designer that is going to build a product like the dating app, right? And the engineer would come in to extend the platform. I think that's what's going to become the most exciting things coming out, because it's going to reconcile a little bit, the coders and no coders, because right now there's kind of a rift between them. It's going to free engineering talent to actually work on new things, because if you think about the leverage that provides, like if, you were to build Tinder on a no-code platform, well, you're probably going to need maybe 5 engineers to work on these secret sauce, but everything else, you don't need those engineers, and these engineers can actually start working on new things. So God knows what they're going to do, but that's definitely going to lead to interesting innovation. And then even going further than that, I'm hoping really that 10 years from now we don't talk about no-code anymore, and it's just a new way to build things. It's visual interface to build products, and coders extending the thing when needed, which if you think about it, is exactly what happened in the early 90s and late 80s. Like Ryan was saying, NoCode started 30 years ago. That's exactly the case. Like, MS-DOS and Windows, MS-DOS was code, Windows was no code. I mean, we're talking about the same thing here. So the new way will be visual. And when you need to go low level because something is missing, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you would buy a piece of software. 5 years from now, you would buy like a Bubble plugin or another of these platforms.
That's an interesting viewpoint. I'm glad that you're bringing it up too, because I think, in my opinion, I think it's going to be similar to the websites, right? And the fact that there's still people building websites with code, right? Because they want custom functionality and stuff like that. Even though all of these website builders have been around for so long now, and there's WordPress and Wix and Squarespace and whatnot, but there's always going to be some level of custom, to it.
But the